Due to the nature of this kind of video conference, I wasn't able to send out materials ahead of time so that you would have those. So what I've done is post them on our Region 9 webpage. So if you would like to follow along with the PowerPoint that I'll be using this morning and look at the materials that I'll be referencing, then you may go to the Region 9 webpage, which is what I have on the screen right now. This is our home page. That web address is www.esc9.net. Once you're on the home page, click on the Services tab at the top of the screen. When you click on the Services tab, go down to Accountability and Compliance. That will bring you to this screen. That very first highlighted yellow portion that says Final Decisions 2018 Accountability, that will take you to the PowerPoint that we'll be using this morning. The next one is a list of official substitute assessments that we'll discuss this morning. The next is a list of CTE courses that are aligned to industry certifications, and then of course the industry certification approved list. So again, if you'd like to access these resources or pull them up and follow along as we go through them this morning, you're more than welcome to do that. They'll also be displayed on the screen. I'll give you just a few seconds to do that while I click over to our PowerPoint for today. All right. Well, the commissioner did release his final decisions earlier this week, and so as I said, we still don't have the complete picture, but we're getting very close. And so let's just take a few minutes to go through what we do know as of today for 2018 accountability. In the student achievement domain, there were not any big surprises. There were things that we talked about all year that we knew were going to be in there. The elementary and middle schools will have 100% of their student achievement domain weight come from the STAR test. That is the average of your approaches, meets, and masters at the all students, all test categories. At the high school, K-12, and districts, it's a little bit different. There are actually 3 components that go into Domain 1 to calculate your Domain 1 score. That is your STAR average of approaches, meets, and masters. That will be a 40% weight of the total domain. Your percentage of kids who meet at least one indicator on college, career, and military readiness. That will be another 40% of the total weight. And then your graduation rate will come in to make up the remaining 20% of that domain weight. So again, none of those are new. There had been a little bit of debate about what the weighting would be for high schools, K-12s, and districts. It turned out to be what we had anticipated, so no surprises there. So just as a reminder, in order to calculate that STAR component of a student achievement, 1 point is given for each percentage of assessment results that are at or above the following performance levels: approaches grade level or above, meets grade level or above, and masters grade level or above. Those percentages of those performance levels will be added together, and then you divide by 3. One of the things that I want to remind you is that substitute assessments can be included here, and they will be included at the meets grade level standard. So, a little bit of disappointment in this area. ATAC and other committees had recommended that those substitute assessment results be calculated in at the master's grade level. The commissioner did not agree with this, and so he agreed to include them. However, if a student meets that substitute assessment requirement, it will be counted as a meets grade level performance student rather than a master's. In the attachments on our webpage, I did include the list of approved substitute assessments. So if you're not familiar with what those are, you might want to check that out on our webpage. Okay, I hear a question, but it's not loud enough. So if there's a question, would you repeat that, please?
Remind them to mute.
Is there a question out there? Okay, if you'll mute your mic, I think we'll be good to go. So mute your mic. And again, if you were trying to ask a question, I could hear talking, but I couldn't tell if that was a question. So you can always text it to my cell phone as well, 940-631-0602. Otherwise, maybe it was just background chatter. So please remember to mute your mic. All right, so in the student achievement domain, let's talk just a few minutes about college, career, and military readiness. Remember, this is 40% of the weight for high schools, K-12s, and districts. The first indicator that a student may meet is that if the student takes an AP or an IB exam, any subject, the student must have at least a 3 if it's an AP exam or a 4 if it's an IB exam. The next indicator is meet the TSI criteria, and that's on either SAT, ACT, TSI, or a college prep course in reading and in math. There is a list or a chart that I'll put in the attachments. I don't think it's there now, but I'll add it to it, that tells you what those minimum scores are for each of those assessments in reading and math in order to be considered meeting this TSI criteria. The student doesn't have to meet the reading criteria and the math criteria on the same assessment. For example, a student may do really well on the math portion of the SAT and not so well on the reading. They may meet the math TSI requirement on SAT. However, when they take ACT, they meet the reading. That's okay, as long as they meet math and reading on at least one of those assessments. The next indicator is complete a course for dual credit. So it's not really a course in every case. As you can see in that little notation, it's 9 or more hours in any subject or 3 hours in ELA/R or math. For example, if a student takes college algebra and passes that course, then they are done. They've met this requirement for accountability, for the campus accountability. However, if they take, say, history, econ, some other subject course, then it takes at least 9 hours. If they take English 1301, then that has met this requirement. So just know that ELA/R or math, it's just 1 3-hour course. Any other subject, it's 9 hours total. The next indicator is earn an associate's degree while in high school. Over in the career ready indicators, this is new. So here's something we need to talk about. All year long, we've debated with the commissioner on whether or not he's going to count coherent sequence of CTE courses, which is what we used to be rated on in the old system. So the commissioner came up with a bit of a compromise, and this is his compromise. CTE coherent sequence course completion and credit aligned with an approved industry certification gets 1/2 point. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail on the next slide, so hold on to that. Another option is to earn industry-based certification. And then this one is also new. You might have seen it in a previous release, although this is the first time that I had seen it actually included in the domain. Graduates with a complete IEP and workforce readiness. So these are most likely your special education students who graduate, and the graduation code is either an 04, an 05, a 54, or a 55. Now, I struck through 04 and 05 because those are old graduation type codes. I don't think we have anyone using those anymore. So you're most likely going to need to look at your 2017 graduates to see if they had a 54 or a 55 graduation type code. And then the last indicator is the military readiness, and that one says enlist in the United States Armed Forces. It will be a district requirement to keep up with that at the district level. There is no official reporting tool from the military to school districts, so make sure you're keeping track of students who enlist in the military. So let's talk just a little bit more about that CTE issue. This year and next year, 1 point is given for each annual graduate. And remember, because these are graduation-related indicators, we're talking about your class of 2017, your graduates who graduated last May. So if any one of those graduates did not meet any of these other criteria, and CTE is their only hope, then here's your option. 1 point is given for each, 1 point is given for each annual graduate who accomplishes any one of the following CCMR indicators except for the CTE coherent sequence graduates. It's CTE, it's 1/2 point is given for each CTE coherent sequence graduate who completes coursework aligned to the approved list of industry certifications. There's a caveat to that. So here it is. So in 2018 and 19, CTE coherent sequence graduates who complete and receive credit for at least one course aligned with CTE industry-based certifications earn 1/2 point. That list of courses is on our website, and it's in those attachments that I pointed out to you at the beginning of the webinar. So you can look at that list and see if your 2017 graduates might have taken one of those courses on that list. So, question out there? Do I have a question? Okay. All right, so you can look at the list of courses. Now for accountability in 2020 and 2021, it changes a little bit. CTE coherent sequence graduates who complete and receive credit for a pathway of courses towards an industry-based certification earn 1/2 point. So remember that a pathway is 2 or more courses for 3 or more credits that are in those pathways. There's also a list of those pathways. Actually, I don't think the list of pathways is on the website, but the list of approved industry certifications are posted on the website. For 2022 and beyond, only graduates who earn an industry-based certification will earn 1 point. So again, we have a little bit of time to adjust, and this only comes into play if your 2017 graduates did not meet any of those other indicators. Do I have any questions about this before I move on? Okay. Graduation rates. So graduation rates will include the 4-year, 5-year, and 6-year longitudinal rates. So it'll be the best of, whichever one is best for you, and that does include state exclusions, or annual dropout rate if the graduation rate is not available for the campus or the district. Do we have any questions about Domain 1 before I move on to school progress? No Domain 1 questions. Okay, I'll just remind you to mute your mic. You can do that if you hover towards the bottom of your screen. You'll see a microphone there. Click on it. It should have a line through it to let you know that it's muted. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Domain 2, school progress. So for elementary, middle, and high school K-12s, campuses, and districts, the higher scaled score, and we're going to talk about what a scaled score is in a few minutes, the higher scaled score of Part A, which has now been renamed, it used to be student growth, it has now been renamed to academic growth, or Part B, relative performance, is used to calculate the school progress domain rating. So all year we've gone back and forth. Is it going to be an average of Part A and Part B? Is it going to be the better of? So now we know that it is the better of Part A or Part B in school progress. So let's talk about Part A, and that should not say student growth anymore. It should say academic growth. So school progress Part A, academic growth, includes all assessments with a STAR progress measure. Now, that means your reading and math. So remember, in Domain 2, the only tests that count for you are reading and math, and those are at the 4th grade and above. It's because, remember, third grade is your baseline year. Starting in fourth grade, you can get a progress measure. Districts and campuses, including high schools, which is new because that's also been debated all year. So yes, high schools do get Part A, will earn credit for results that maintain proficiency and growth growth expectations on STAR. Substitute assessments are not included in Domain 2. So this chart we're fairly familiar with. So just think of it this way, that when you're looking at your fourth graders and above, you look at the previous year's STAR test and compare it to the current year. So the first thing you look at are the proficiency levels. Proficiency levels are those does not meet, approaches, meets, or masters. That is your proficiency level. Your progress measure, or your expected growth, is that comparison of your scale score from one year to the next. And each test and grade level has a required number of scale score points increase that indicates one academic year of growth. Both of those things are important when looking at the school progress domain. So for example, if a student goes from does not meet, so they didn't pass the test, the next year they still don't pass the test, so their proficiency level is still does not meet. However, you look at that scale score comparison and they've actually increased enough scale score points that they gained a year of academic growth, then that student still gets 1 point. However, if they went from does not meet to does not meet and did not gain enough scale score points, then it's 0 points that student is worth. It's also important to keep in mind that this chart is not cumulative. You don't go across and add them all up. What this means is every student who takes either a reading or a math assessment and is able to calculate a progress measure will either have 0 points, a half point, or 1 point. It's the maximum you're going to get. This cell is new. So this is a change from what we've talked about in previous discussions about accountability. This cell used to say 1 point. So if a student was on MEETS grade level one year and was on MEETS grade level performance the following year, they got 1 point. Well, the commissioner has made a slight adjustment, and now he's also looking at the scale score at the MEETS grade level. So not only do they have to maintain MEETS to MEETS, but they also have to show enough scale score increase to get that progress measure. This is what it looks like for students taking STAR Alt 2. So I'll let you look at that for a few minutes and think about any questions that you may want to ask me about School Progress Domain Part A. All right, just as a reminder, at the high school level, the only two assessments that have a progress measure are Algebra 1 and English 2. The rest of your reading or math assessments do not have an opportunity for being included in the school progress domain. Okay, if there aren't any questions about school progress Part A, let's move into school progress Part B, relative performance. So school progress Part B, relative performance, evaluates the achievement of all students relative to district or campuses with similar socioeconomic statuses. So relative performance for elementary schools are the student achievement domain, the student achievement STAR component results compared to elementary schools with similar percentages of economically disadvantaged students. At the middle school, it's the same thing. It's just that they are compared to only middle schools with similar percentages of economically disadvantaged students. And when they release the accountability manual, that manual will include lookup tables. On those lookup tables, it will give you a range of percentage of economically disadvantaged students. So it may say anywhere from, for example, 20% to 25.1%. So if you fall within that range, then you look at what your STAR component of Domain 1 score was, and that's how you'll get your letter grade. So there will be a lookup table provided to determine if you're going to be an A, B, C, D, or F in relative performance. At the elementary and middle school, that's all you look at is what was your Domain 1 score, what is your percentage of economically disadvantaged. You use those two pieces of information to find what your letter grade would be. At the high school, K-12 and districts with CCMR components available, it's a little different. You take the STAR average, so that is your STAR component from Domain 1, and your CCMR. You do not include graduation rate, but you take those two components and you average them together. That's what gives you your Domain 1 score to then compare to other campuses with similar percentages of economically disadvantaged students. Relative performance at high schools, K-12s, and districts without CCMR components. So there may be some campuses out there that don't have a CCMR component. It's just your STAR component only, just as it is with elementary and middle schools. So it's the average of approaches, meets, and masters. For AEA districts and campuses, districts and campuses that are AEA are not evaluated on School Progress Part B, relative performance, due to the small number of comparisons. Substitute assessments are included at the meets grade level standard for this particular portion of Domain 2. All right, any questions about relative performance or academic growth? School progress domain. All right, then let's move on to closing the gaps. So just as a reminder, as we're talking about closing the gaps, keep in mind that this is where all of the federal accountability requirements are found. This is the only domain that examines results based on those student groups. In Domain 1 and 2, it's at the all students level, so you're not even looking at all your individual student groups until you get to this domain. So on the left side of the screen, you'll see a list of those student groups. There are 15 of them. The new ones are towards the bottom. Just as a reminder, the new groups that will be counted this year are current and former. Those are two separate groups. Special ed, current and monitored English learners, and then monitored is through the 4th year. And then you have two additional groups, continuously enrolled and non-continuously enrolled. So those are your 15 student groups that you'll be looking at as you go through this third domain. Domain 3, closing the gaps, has 4 major components to it. The first component is academic achievement in reading and math at the meets grade level or above performance level. The second component is growth in reading and math, and that's only for elementary and middle schools, and that's taken directly from the school progress domain. For high schools, K-12s, and districts, the 4-year federal graduation rate is included as a component. And remember, the 4-year federal graduation rate can be found on your federal report card. Make sure you look at that. It's different from our state graduation rate. The next component is the college, career, and military readiness performance, and that is for high schools, K-12s, and districts only. Student achievement domain score for elementary and middle school. So basically you're looking at what we've already examined in Domain 1, and now you're breaking it down by student group. So what is the average of approaches, meets, and masters in reading for your white student group? What is the average of approaches, meets, and masters in reading for your Hispanic student group, African American, and so forth? English language proficiency status. This is all about the TELPAS test and how kids do on that. This year we have applied for a waiver for the 2018 accountability cycle. All indications is that waiver will be accepted by the feds. So you'll see I've kind of referenced the waiver throughout this domain. If we get word that it hasn't been accepted, then I don't really know what the plan is, because our TELPAS test has been restructured, and so therefore it's really not valid for this year's accountability cycle. So in this academic achievement component of Domain 3, this will include STAR performance. It's the percentage of kids who are at the MEETS grade level or above in reading and in math. Just remember that the targets are set by individual student group, so the target is not the same for every student group. It's based on 2017 baseline data. So at the state level, so those targets are set based on the 2017 data for every individual student group. So you'll see that there are different percentages. For example, the all students group could possibly be 44% needing to be at that MEETS grade level or above. However, if you look at the white student group, that target looks like it may be around the 60%. Special ed target looks like it's going to be somewhere around the 19% area. So again, just remember that those vary by student groups. And those final targets will come out in the accountability manual. Earlier in the year, we talked about Safe Harbor being part of Domain 3. Safe Harbor was not approved by the federal government, and so, or the federal education, so that was taken out, so no Safe Harbor. Substitute assessments are included at the MEETS grade level standard for this portion of Domain 3. Growth. So growth in elementary and middle schools, the school progress domain. That is taken from Domain 2, and it's growth in reading and in math, and it's looked at or evaluated by each individual student group. Graduation rates, it's the 4-year federal graduation rate without exclusions, and just remember that those exclusions are if the student moves out of country, they're not counted against you. If the student moves to another state and enrolls in an accredited high school or accredited campus, they are not counted against you. Or if the student is deceased, they're not counted against you. The targets are set by individual student groups for this as well. For growth, it's by subject area, and there is no safe harbor. The next component that we'll look at in closing the gaps is school quality and student success. So this varies a little bit depending on what campus type you are. The high schools, K-12s, and districts, this is just looking at your college career and military readiness. So taking from Domain 1 and now analyzing that CCMR through the lens of all the student groups that you have. At the elementary and middle schools, it is looking at the student achievement domain STAR score only. So again, just like we did in Domain 1, but rather than looking at it at the all students, all tests combined level, now we're looking at it through the lens of all your student groups. Targets, again, are set by student group, and no safe harbor is allowed. If a campus does not have a CCMR component, then it reverts back to the student achievement component. So participation status. So this is a little bit new.
I got a question.
Yes. What's your question?
So on the high school and K through 12 and districts, they will not consider student achievement at all. It is strictly CCMR.
That is true. In this particular domain, so only in Domain 3, for that top one, it's only the CCMR for K-12s, districts, and high school campuses.
Okie doke, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about participation status. So this is kind of a throwback to olden days. If you remember the days of AYP, we had that portion in there where you had to have at least 95% participation rates. And if you didn't, they added what we used to call artificial failures. Same philosophy is applied to, again, this year. So you have to have at least a 95% participation rate. It is based on STAR, and when TELPAS is included, which will probably not be this year, but when TELPAS is included, it also will include TELPAS. Substitute assessments are included as participants. Students that have no authentic academic response are included. Medical exceptions and medically exempt designations are not included in the numerator nor the denominator. And should the participation status for the all students group or any student group fall below 95%, the denominator used for calculating the closing the gaps academic achievement component is adjusted to include the necessary number of assessments to meet the 95% threshold. In short, what that's telling us is that if you don't have at least 95% of your kids participating, then there will be artificial failures. In other words, the denominator will be increased by however many tests it takes to reach that 95% threshold. However, they will not be counted as passers in the numerator. So that's where that artificial failure term comes into play. So adjusted academic achievement performance calculations, here's an example of how that would work. So the campus's participation rate for this particular sample for ELA or reading is 93%. And the way they got that is they had 100 assessments that were scored, and those included absent or other answer documents. There were 100 submitted, 93 of those were scored, so therefore their participation rate was 93%, or 90, was it adjusted? Sorry. The performance denominator must be adjusted to include assessments to meet the 95% target. Here they only had a 93%. On the next slide, it shows us that the original ELA calculation would have been 53 assessments. Of those 93 were at the MEETS grade level, standard or above. So that particular example yielded a 57% passing rate. The adjusted ELA-R reading academic achievement performance calculations to meet that 95% participation rate threshold meant that because there weren't at least 95% of those assessments, then they added 2 in the denominator.
Somebody was here, our tech support.
Is there somebody out there with a question? Okay, so I'm going to move on. So, that's really not new. The artificial failures, we've had that in the past. We just haven't had that in recent years. So here is some new information. This was new to us at the ESCs. So I want you to really listen to this because I've looked at some of the campuses, just kind of spot checked. And I think this is going to be important because I think this is going to mean that some of our campuses are not going to get to use all of the components to calculate their overall scores. So let's dive into this a bit. So this applies to elementary, middle, high schools, K-12s, and districts. The district or campus must have 10 reading and 10 mathematics assessment results in the academic achievement component to be evaluated on closing the gaps domain. The second bullet says cumulative performance for each component is based on the total number of eligible student groups that meet minimum size criteria. The minimum sizes are 10 assessments for the all students and 25 assessments for student groups. So when you're looking at your all students, you have to have at least 10. When you're looking at each of those student groups, all 15 of those, or the remaining 14, I guess, you have to have at least 25 tests, or that group does not count for you. The number of indicators met for each component is totaled and then divided by the total count of indicators evaluated, resulting in an overall percentage for each of the domain components. At the elementary, middle school, and K-12 and districts, the following components must have a minimum of 5 indicators that meet minimum size to be included in the closing the gaps domain: academic achievement, star growth, and the student achievement domain score star component only. The remaining components only require 1 evaluated indicator. Percentages for each component are then weighted based on the district or campus type to calculate an overall domain score. So let's look at what that really means. So this is very, very important. some of our campuses are going to miss out on getting to count all of these components in Domain 3. So for this example that's on the screen now, let's look. This particular campus had 75 tests in the all students category in reading. So the minimum size is 10 for all students. So yes, that student group counts. That's why there's a Y where it says met minimum size. In their African American student group, they only had 13 assessments. Therefore, they didn't have enough to count African Americans, so that is a no. 26 in Hispanic, the minimum size is 25 for all of your student groups other than the all students. So Hispanics met that minimum size of 25, so that's a yes. You go all the way across, and it shows that there were 4 indicators in reading that met minimum size. In math, they did the same thing, but only 3 of those indicators were met. The all students category, the white, and the continuously enrolled. So there were 4 in reading and 3 in math, so therefore there were 7 total indicators evaluated. So remember that the minimum size for this is 5. Well, 7 is greater than 5, so yes, this academic achievement will be included in the overall calculation. This is where I think it's going to catch us at. In our region, we have a lot of schools that do not have very many kids that are going to get growth indicators. And as you see on this slide, STAR growth is also required to have at least 5 indicators. So I've already looked at some of our campuses, and I already know that we have campuses out there that do not have enough student groups on this in the growth area to count growth. So, for example, some of the campuses I looked at, they met minimum size in all students reading and all students math. They met minimum size in maybe the white student group in reading and in math. But those were the only student groups that they met minimum size in. So 2 in reading and 2 in math. That total is only 4. 4 is less than 5. So that would mean that growth does not get counted at all for that campus in Domain 3. That becomes very important as we start looking at the weighting. So these numbers are only a draft. They're just a target. I just wanted you to see for a moment what I'm talking about. So if you look at each of those student groups across the top, I've reminded you of what the minimum size is. It's 10 for all students. It's 25 for all the rest of them. That does include, this chart does not have all 15 student groups on it, because remember, we still have to include ELL monitored student group, continuously enrolled, and non-continuously enrolled, but there's just not enough room on a slide to include all 15 categories or student groups. So this has reading and math at meets or above, so that's your academic achievement component. The next 2 rows are growth for elementary and middle schools in reading and in math. That is the growth component of Domain 3. The next row is CCMR at high schools and K-12s. That is in place of growth. High schools and K-12s will use CCMR, looked at through all the individual student groups. The next component is Student Success Indicator Domain 1 STAR component. So again, that's your average of approaches, meets, and masters at all your tests, but now it's broken down into student groups. And then, of course, you've got participation rates in reading and in math, and then your graduation rate for 4-year longitudinal, and that's that federal graduation rate. These targets that I have on here are not final. I think they're going to be close. There may be a few adjustments, but just know that when the accountability manual is released, you will have those targets for each student group. So here's another way of looking at that. So this one is same information, it's just color-coded. So you can see that yellow bar indicates those are the things that fall within the academic achievement component of Domain 3. The green is what counts for growth at elementary and middle schools and graduation rate at high schools, K-12s, and districts for that particular component of Domain 3. The ELP, that kind of a tealish blue color, that's the one that we're going to seek a waiver for this year. So chances are nothing in that component will count for us this year. And then that orange section is school quality and student success. For high schools and K-12s and districts, that's just the CCMR component of or piece of Domain 1. For elementary and middle schools, it's the STAR component from Domain 1. It's that average of approaches, meets, and masters broken down by student group. Here are the weights. This is where it starts getting a little bit scary for me. So the weights for an elementary and middle school campus is 30% of your total domain score comes from this yellow portion of this chart. 50% of your overall weight for Domain 3 comes from the growth, which is the green portion of this chart. Another 10% would come from ELP if we don't get the waiver. However, if we do receive the waiver, that 10% will be proportionately distributed to the other remaining components. So not equally distributed or just contributed to one or the other, but proportionally distributed to the remaining 3. And then the last component is the STAR achievement domain score, the STAR component only. So again, that averages of approaches, meets, and masters. So it's the orange portion of this group. That gets 10%. So remember, you're going to look and see how many student groups did I have. Did I have at least 5 in those top 3? Sorry, I guess it's all of them. Second question you'll ask yourself is, how many did I get evaluated on? That's your denominator. Your numerator is how many of those did I hit the target or get above the target on? That's your percentage for that particular domain. So let's say that you were evaluated on, 10 student groups in that yellow section, and of those 10, you met the target on 5. Then that means you get a 50 for academic achievement. Well, then that academic achievement, that 50 is going to be multiplied times 30% for the weight to get your Domain 3 portion. Now, here's the problem right here, and I've added this. This is not what TEA included. This is what I included. So when you proportionately distribute that 10% for ELP that's not going to be there if we get the waiver, then that changes those weights just a little bit. If you have the remaining 3 components, enough student groups, you have at least 5 indicators evaluated, then that changes those weights to 33.3% for academic achievement, 55.6% for STAR growth, nothing for ELP, and then 11.1% for that student achievement domain STAR component only portion. However, here's the scary part. If you're an elementary or a middle school campus and you don't have enough kids to be evaluated on the STAR growth proportion of this, which is 50% of this domain, then that means, and remember that's 4th grade and above, and you have to have 25 tests in those student groups, then that means that 50% you don't get from growth. That 50% gets proportionately distributed among the remaining 2 if we get the waiver for ELP. So that means that your academic achievement is now going to be counted as 75% of this domain, and the STAR achievement domain 1 score, which is basically all your STAR tests broken out by student group, is another 25%. So I think that's something that you need to go back and really look at and see how many of your student groups are going to meet minimum size. And will you get to count all of these components, or will just some of these components be counted for you? At the high schools, K-12s, AA, and districts, the weighting is a little bit different. Academic achievement counts for 50%. Your federal graduation rate counts for 10%. That English language proficiency is another 10%. However, that's the portion we're getting the waiver on. And college, career, and military readiness is 30%. If you don't have if you don't have a college, career, and military readiness, then it goes back to that STAR component. I don't think we have any campuses, I know we don't, in our region that would apply to. I had the question yesterday, well, who would that apply to? Think about our larger districts in the state that maybe have 9, 10 grade level campuses, so or ninth grade center. They're technically a high school, but they don't have a CCMR rate, so therefore they would use STAR. So this is the weight as I calculate it if the waiver goes away, or sorry, if the waiver is approved for ELP. That 10% will be proportionately distributed, and so that's really what the weighting will look more like on this particular one. Any questions about that? All right, so again, I would go back and look at your enrollment counts and start looking to see what student groups you have. So here's how an example of how the elementary closing the gaps will be calculated. So this just happens to be an elementary example. So let's look at the components first on the left-hand blue side, blue column. Academic achievement, this particular campus had 69% of the indicators that they had enough kids to meet. So 69% of their indicators were met. So that 69 would be weight multiplied times a 30% weight, which really I don't think it's going to be 30%. I think it's going to be either 33.3 or 75, depending on how many student groups you meet, for a total of 20.7. This particular example shows that 83% of the indicators were met at student growth times 50% would be 41.5 points. That's a lot of points to come from that particular indicator, keeping in mind that if you don't have enough kids for student growth, that's nothing there. And then ELP, if it were in play, again, they'd get 10 points from that. Student achievement, they met 60% of their targets, times 10%, they got 6 points. All the points are added up. You see that that's a 78. So we're going to have scale scores, and so I'll explain that in just a moment, but that 78 would fall into the C range. So this particular example would yield us a C. So the next slide talks a little bit about English language learners who are in U.S. schools for 1 year. They are excluded from the accountability performance calculations. Also, due to changes in the TELPAS assessment, Texas is going to request that waiver from the U.S. Department of Education to exclude the EL students who are year 2 in U.S. schools from 2018 performance. If it's granted, ELs who are in their second year in U.S. schools will be included in accountability for 2019 and beyond. STAR Alt 2 assessment results will be included regardless of an EL's years in U.S. schools. And then also keep in mind that asylees, refugees, and students with interrupted formal education are not included in state accountability until their 6th year in U.S. schools. So let's talk about how ratings will be calculated. Any questions before I move on? All right, let's talk about ratings. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a scaling process. So districts, scaled scores were created to align letter grades and scores used in the A through F academic accountability system to common conceptions of letter grades. Campuses, scale scores were established by campus type. So what that's telling us is that there will be a district conversion of what you get as a raw score to your scale score, and then there will also be a conversion chart for if you're an elementary campus, a middle school campus, a high school campus, or a K-12. So when you scale score to common conceptions of letter grades, what that means is that, for example, let's say that when you calculate domain 1 and you're an elementary campus and you average your approaches, meets, and masters of all tests, all students, and when you do that, you come out with, let's say, a 42. Well, that 42 will then be converted into a scale score. Based on all the data that comes in, those scaled scores will be converted, meaning that that 42 may line up with a, let's say, a 58. Well, the 58 may fall into the B category. So basically what we're saying is your raw score will be converted into a scale score. Those scale scores are 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 89 is a B, 70 to 79 is a C, 60 to 69 is a D, and anything below a 59 or below scaled score is an F. So that chart will come out. The cut points for all of those conversions will come out in hopefully mid-May when the accountability manual is released. Questions about scaled scores? Just remember that when you do your raw calculation, that's your raw score. When the accountability manual comes out, you'll look up what your raw score was when it's converted into a scaled score, what that falls into, an A, B, C, D, or an F. So when calculating your overall ratings, the first step you'll take is to determine the better outcome of student achievement and the school progress domain scaled scores. So after you've converted them. Step 2, you're going to weight the better outcome of student achievement or school progress domain scaled score at 70%. Step 3, weight the closing the gaps domain scaled score at 30%. Step 4, total the weighted outcome of the two scaled scores to calculate the overall score. So let's look at what that really looks like. So in this particular example, in the student achievement domain, the scaled score came out to be an 89. In school progress part A, the scaled score came out to be an 84. In school progress part B, that relative performance, the scale score came out to be a 72. So the first thing that you have to ask is which was better, part A or part B for this campus? Well, it is part B because 84 is higher than 72. Then you're going to compare which is better. From school progress, is that 84 better or is the 89 from student achievement? Well, 89 is higher than 84, so that means that the student achievement domain receives a 70% weight, which comes out to be 62.3 points. Now you go down to closing the gaps. Your closing the gaps domain score is an 81. You now multiply that times 30. That comes out to 24.3. Add those two totals together, you get an 87. An 87 falls in that scaled score range of a B. So for this campus, they would receive a B. So districts A, B, C, or D assigned for overall performance and for performance in each domain to districts that is assigned, to meet the performance targets for the letter grades. So in other words, if you're an A through a D, you're going to not get a improvement required rating. An F is assigned for overall performance and for performance in each domain to include districts, including AEAs, that do not meet performance targets to earn at least a D. Not rated is assigned to districts under certain specific circumstances, and they do not receive a rating at all. Here's something new. So a MET standard label at the campus level will be given to each domain based on how many of the performance targets that it meets. So you'll have a student achievement domain, either MET standard or improvement required label. You'll have a school progress domain, either MET standard or improvement required label. You will have a closing the achievements gaps domain rating of either MET standard or improvement required. And then you will also have an overall MET standard or improvement required label at the campus level. The 2018 cut points for districts and campuses will reflect high expectations for student achievement, academic growth, and reducing achievement gaps among students. An effort is being made to establish A cut points equating to high achievement and C cut points for equating to average achievement. The rationale for these thresholds is consistent for the overall cut points and across each domain. Additional information about cut points and lookup tables is expected to be released with the 2018 Accountability Manual. Any questions about that before we move through distinctions? Okay, so distinctions. Distinctions have changed just a little bit, so I won't read these to you. Just know that you can find what those distinctions are on this chart. Some of them are very similar to what we've had in the past. Others have changed a little bit because our accountability system has changed so much. Comprehensive, targeted, and additional targeted support and improvement. So this year we will not have priority and focus labels for campuses. Now remember, those are federal accountability labels, and they will remain to be the federal. However, there are changes. So comprehensive support identification. Only schools that receive a comprehensive support label based on performance in Domain 3 will receive any federal funding for improvement. Now, in past years, comprehensive would have been similar to priority, meaning that our focus campuses, what we used to call focus, most likely will not receive funding. However, I do think that more campuses will be included in that comprehensive support label identification. So the Closing the Gaps domain scaled score will be used to rank and identify schools for comprehensive support. Comprehensive is similar to priority. The agency will identify at least the lowest 5% of Title I Part A campuses based on the scaled score for comprehensive support. Campuses that do not rank in the bottom 5% of the Closing the Gaps domain for 2 consecutive years and have increased a letter grade, for example, an F to a D or a D to a C, on the Closing the Gaps domain will be considered as having successfully exited comprehensive support. So this means 1 year of comprehensive label gets you in the system, then you have to stay out or you have to be good for 2 years before you can no longer be labeled a comprehensive support campus. Comprehensive support identification. If a campus does not obtain a 67% 4-year graduation rate for all student groups, the campus will automatically be identified for comprehensive support and improvement. Any Title I campus identified for targeted support and improvement for 3 consecutive years will be identified for comprehensive support and improvement the following year. TEA will annually identify campuses for comprehensive support and interventions beginning with the 2018 accountability release, which is based on school years 2017-18 performance data. Targeted support is a different identification. So targeted support and improvement identification. This begins with the 2018-19 rating. So student group achievement will be monitored annually through the Closing the Gaps domain. Any campus with 1 or more consistently underperforming student groups will be identified for targeted support and improvement. TEA defines consistently underperforming as a school having 1 or more student groups that do not meet interim benchmark goals for 3 consecutive years. Campuses will be identified annually for the first time in August 2019, and this will be based on the 3 years of 17, 18, and 19 data. Additional targeted support is a little different from just targeted support. Any campus that is not identified for comprehensive or targeted support will be identified for additional targeted support if an individual student group's percentage of evaluated indicators met is at or below the percentage used to identify that campus type for comprehensive support. For example, if 25% of evaluated indicators is met, indicators met is the cut point for elementary schools to be identified for comprehensive support, then any elementary campus with a student group that has met 25% or fewer of its evaluated indicators will be identified for additional targeted support. To exit, any consistently underperforming student group must meet at least 50% of the indicators evaluated and meet the targets for academic achievement component in both reading and math. Identification will begin with the August 2018 ratings and will occur on an annual basis. So keep this in mind. Just if you are labeled as additional targeted support or identified as additional targeted support, you will have intervention requirements to complete. You will not get funding for that. If you are a targeted support campus beginning in 2019, not additional, but just targeted, you will be identified as having interventions to go through, but you will not get funding for that. The only schools that get funded for, get extra money for improvement are those that, number one, are Title I campuses, and number two, are labeled as comprehensive. And that all comes from Domain 3 only. All right, so let's look at the 2018 accountability calendar. As you can see, last Thursday was supposed to be the release of the final decisions. It actually didn't come out until Tuesday, I think, or Wednesday of this week. April 30th through May the 11th was when the campus comparison groups campus pairing, let me start over. April 30th through May the 11th is the campus pairing process. So if you want to change which campus is paired with which campus, that has to be done pretty quickly before April 30th. May and June, public comment period for chapters 1 through 9 of that accountability manual. They'll be based on the public web or posted on the public web. June is when your list of your 2018 campus comparison group is released. June is also when you'll get that list of the confidential list of CCMR graduates for 2018 accountability. So that has always come in June. It used to be our post-secondary readiness release. That'll be that list that shows you all of your 2017 graduates on the left side of the page, and then going across the top will be all of those CCMR indicators, and it'll either have a 0 or a 1 if the student met that indicator. Remember, the student only has to meet one of those indicators, and then your CCMR is based on what percentage of 2017 graduates met at least one of those indicators. Late summer, the 2018 accountability manual will be released and the appendices. And then August, campuses will be identified under the new PEG criteria for 2019-20 school year. So just think about this, that accountability manual is going to come out in about mid-May, chapters 1 through 9. Very rarely do things change during that public comment period. By law, it has to be posted for public comment for at least 30 days before it can be final. But when that comes out for public review, I think you can start kind of making some plans around that. I don't suspect it's going to change a whole lot. All right, so these are the resources that I used for this PowerPoint. TA did provide the PowerPoint to ESCs. However, I did enhance it a bit with some of those things that I placed in bold and red and added just to keep a reminder so you can see those throughout. This PowerPoint is on the Region 9 website, along with other resources, which include the substitute assessment list, the courses for CTE credit, and the approved industry certification list. So do I have any questions? If you have any questions that come to mind, you're welcome to call or email me anytime. My email address is mickey.wesley@esc9.net. And again, if there aren't any questions, then I will bid you a good day and hope that you have had a great week of testing. Good luck to all of you out there. And I will have full day accountability trainings in beginning this summer. During those trainings, we'll ask you to bring your data, and we'll actually calculate and walk you through each one of those domains in great detail. So if you have any questions in the meantime, give me a holler. Thank you and have a great day.